I was standing naked in the shower, facing him, the one I had come to trust. The water was streaming down my body, and I felt exposed yet alive. His hands had already slipped down, his lips dangerously close. This was not supposed to happen, yet I did not stop. I surrendered to the moment, letting the heat and the steam blur the lines between right and wrong. I always took my late-night showers when the house was quiet. It was my escape, a time when no one could interrupt me. But this time, nothing went as planned. The bathroom door swung open abruptly, without any warning. I spun around. There, frozen on the threshold, stood Evan. Water still clung to my skin as the hot steam filled the room. His eyes met mine, and in that gaze, I saw something dangerous. For a moment, the charged air between us crackled with unspoken tension. "Oh, damn," he muttered, his voice low and edged with surprise. I waited, expecting him to step aside and leave. Yet he did not move. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. "I didn't know you were here," he mumbled, not turning away from me. His tone was neither accusatory nor apologetic. It was simply matter-of-fact. I should have pulled the shower curtain closed, grabbed a towel, or even said something sharp. But I did nothing. I remained rooted in place, caught between the urgency of the moment and a growing sense of dread. Every instinct in me screamed to act, yet I stayed silent. The shower's warm cascade washed over me as I tried to process the situation. My mind raced. Was it a mistake? Had I let things go too far? Questions swirled as the water blurred my thoughts. Evan's presence changed everything. I could feel his gaze, steady and unyielding, pressing me into the present. His eyes, dark and unreadable, suggested that he had noticed more than just my vulnerability. There was an intensity there, a promise of consequences that I had not anticipated. I looked away, trying to gather my composure. The sound of the water provided a steady background to the rising tension. My heart pounded, not from desire now, but from a mix of fear and confusion. I had expected a secret moment between two people, but now the situation was charged with something else entirely, an unspoken challenge, an unexpected intrusion into my private escape. Evan did not speak again for a long while. Instead, he remained standing there, his eyes locked on mine as if waiting for my reaction. Each second that passed was a reminder of the boundaries I had blurred and the rules I had broken. His silent presence was louder than any words could be, speaking of unanticipated consequences and a future that was no longer under my control. I weighed my options in that split second. I could cover myself up and demand an explanation. I could ask him to leave and promise that nothing would ever be spoken of again. But the vulnerability of the moment, combined with the sudden escalation of tension, left me speechless. I could only stand there, letting the water drown out the chaos in my mind. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he broke the silence. "I wasn't expecting this," he said quietly, his voice carrying a mix of surprise and something more troubling, an undercurrent of resolve that hinted at consequences yet to come. His words were simple and unadorned, yet they carried the weight of a decision already made. I felt the chill of reality seep in as the shower's warmth no longer felt comforting. The confrontation was real now, and the line between a private escape and a life altered forever had been crossed. I had let my guard down, and now I faced the consequences in the form of Evan's unwavering stare. The room was thick with tension. I could no longer ignore the reality that this moment would not be forgotten. Every second, every drop of water, was etched into my memory as a turning point, a moment when the boundaries of our lives were irrevocably redrawn. The truth of what had happened could not be hidden under a towel or washed away with the water. As the final droplets of water continued to fall, I was left with one burning question that seemed to echo in the silence of the bathroom. Why is he still standing? I tried to forget that moment, to erase the image from my mind. But Evan, no, he wouldn't let it go. Ever since that night, he had changed. His gaze lingered longer than before, and he appeared in places where he should not have been. It was as if he was waiting, always present in the background of my everyday life. One evening, as I walked into the kitchen to fill a glass of water, I heard his voice behind me. "Late again?" he asked, his tone devoid of casual familiarity. I froze. The sound of running water was the only reply for a few seconds, and I turned slowly to see him leaning against the doorway. I managed to ask, "And you?" My voice sounded firmer than I felt. "I was waiting," he said almost too plainly. His eyes were fixed on mine, and I could sense that he was measuring every reaction I made. That night, sleep eluded me. Every creak of the house and every murmur in the dark seemed to signal his presence. I lay in bed, replaying our brief conversation, wondering what had changed between us. The memory of that charged encounter in the bathroom, of the way the moment had spiraled out of control, haunted me with relentless precision. Evan had crossed an invisible line, and now our lives were entangled in a way that left me both intrigued and alarmed. The following morning, I resolved to avoid him. I tried to keep to my routine, determined to reclaim a sense of normalcy. But as I passed through the living room on my way to the door, I saw him again. This time, he was seated in an armchair by the window. He didn't rise to greet me, his posture was relaxed, yet his eyes followed my every move with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It was as if he had positioned himself deliberately, ensuring that escape was impossible. "Let's talk," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence of the room. I stopped in my tracks, the sound of my footsteps muffled on the soft carpet. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was rendered speechless. His invitation was simple and unadorned, yet its implications were anything but. It wasn't a casual conversation he sought. It was a confrontation with a past that I had tried so hard to leave behind. My mind raced. I weighed the options: to engage, to deflect, or perhaps even to flee. But my body betrayed me, rooted to the spot. I could see every detail in his face, the slight set of his jaw, the unyielding tilt of his head, and I knew that nothing short of a clear response would suffice. The air in the room thickened with tension, each moment stretching longer than the last. Evan slowly rose from his chair and took a step forward, closing the distance between us. "We need to clear this up," he stated, his tone both firm and unnervingly calm. His eyes, dark and resolute, searched mine as if expecting a confession or an explanation. I forced a reply, though my voice trembled. "I don't understand what you want from me." The question hung in the air, charged with the weight of unspoken confessions and unresolved decisions. He paused, as if considering his next words carefully. "It's not just about what happened," he replied. "It's about what comes next." His words struck me like a cold splash of water. I realized then that this was not merely about a single moment of weakness. It was about a boundary that had been crossed, one that could never be uncrossed without consequences. I remembered the way his gaze had held me captive in the bathroom, the silence that had followed his unexpected arrival. Now, in the quiet of the living room, that same intensity was back, multiplied by the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same. Every step I had taken since that night felt predetermined, as if I were caught in a web spun by fate itself. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the settling house. Evan's presence was a constant reminder that I could not hide from the past, no matter how desperately I tried. His assertion that what comes next was already in motion sent a chill down my spine. I took a tentative step toward him, my voice low and measured. "What do you expect me to do?" I wasn't sure if I was challenging him or pleading for clarity. His eyes narrowed slightly, and he replied, "I expect you to face it. I expect you to understand that once a line is crossed, nothing is ever the same again." In that moment, the weight of his words settled on me. The confrontation wasn't just with him, it was with every decision I had made since that fateful night. As I stood there, caught between the desire to run and the need to confront the truth, the tension in the room reached its peak. I knew that our conversation would change everything, yet I had no choice but to listen, to see where this new path would lead. I paused, not knowing what to say next, feeling the gravity of his declaration as I braced myself for the next inevitable step in this dangerous, unfolding game. My husband, Thomas, went on a business trip. Since he left, the house has felt either overwhelmingly vast or suffocatingly small, its familiar spaces now echoing with an unsettling emptiness. I couldn't ignore the change any longer. Seeking solace, I stepped out onto the terrace and inhaled the cool night air, hoping it would clear the thoughts swirling in my mind. The quiet of the night was abruptly broken by a soft, measured voice behind me. Not sleeping? It asked. I turned sharply, startled by the unexpected interruption. There, standing by the door that led inside, was Evan. His presence was as persistent as it had been since that fateful evening, his gaze fixed and unyielding even in the dim light. I replied cautiously, "It's too early," though the depth of the night belied my words. Despite my attempt to sound dismissive, a part of me recognized that his presence was not a mere coincidence. Evan remained silent, his eyes holding a steady intensity that made the air between us feel charged with an unspoken urgency. After a long, weighted pause, he finally broke the silence. "I've been thinking about that evening," he said, his tone matter of fact yet layered with implications that I wasn't entirely prepared to confront. I felt my stomach tighten at his admission. The evening he referred to was the one that had upended my life, a moment that should have been consigned to memory, but instead had become a specter haunting my every step. For a few seconds, I forced myself to meet his eyes. There was a challenge in his steady look, as if he was daring me to address the truth. "Forget it," I managed to say, my voice sounding firmer than I felt. I hoped that by dismissing the memory, I could reclaim some control over my thoughts. But his next words left no room for such an easy retreat. "And you?" Evan asked, his question hanging heavily in the cool night air. His tone was blunt, yet it carried a subtle accusation, an insistence that this was not a subject I could merely ignore. His words reminded me that I had already been at a crossroads, a moment when a choice was demanded of me. Between us, there were only a few measured steps, a narrow distance that seemed to stretch and compress with every heartbeat. In that space, I felt the magnitude of the decision before me. It was as though every step I took from that point onward would be irreversible, a departure from the life I had known. I could either retreat into the safety of denial or confront the reality that Evan's presence forced upon me. In that moment, I sensed that this was my final opportunity to step back from the brink. If I did not act now, if I allowed this confrontation to pass without a decisive moment, then I would never find a way out of this labyrinth of guilt and confusion. The thought struck me with alarming clarity. This was the last chance to reclaim control over my destiny, to stop the spiral before it consumed me completely. I shifted my weight, my eyes flickering between the darkened doorway and Evan's unchanging expression. The night seemed to hold its breath as the quiet tension grew, punctuated only by the distant hum of a city and the subtle creaks of the old house settling into its new reality. I realized that every small gesture, every word unspoken, was piling up, marking the lines between the past and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Evan took a subtle step forward, closing the gap between us even further. His movement was deliberate, measured, and it left no doubt that he was not going to vanish as quietly as he had entered. "I've been waiting for you to see what's happened," he said softly. His voice was neither pleading nor threatening, but it carried an undeniable weight, an implication that the events of that evening were not isolated and that the consequences were still unfolding. The cool air on my skin suddenly felt like an insistent reminder of the boundaries I had already crossed. I looked away for a moment, grappling with the reality of the situation. Every detail, the way Evan's eyes lingered, the measured pace of his words, and the unyielding tension between us, spoke of a past that refused to be forgotten. I knew that to remain silent now would be to accept a future in which I was forever trapped by what had transpired. I opened my mouth, intent on asking a question or demanding an explanation, but the words died on my tongue. The space between us was fraught with every unspoken thought, every regret, every hope for escape. As I stood there on the terrace, the cool night air mingling with the heat of our confrontation, I understood that this moment was not merely a fleeting encounter, it was a turning point. If I did not leave now, if I did not take a stand against the pull of the past, then I would never find the strength to walk away. The finality of the choice pressed down on me, urging me to act before it was too late. Yet, as the seconds passed, I found myself unable to move. The decision hovered over me, heavy and unyielding, but I did not take a single step. All day I tried to act as if nothing had changed. I kept my routine, went about my work, and even forced a smile when I met acquaintances. Yet every step I took was shadowed by the lingering thought of that night when everything shifted irreversibly. I was determined to put it behind me, to pretend that life had returned to its normal pace despite the silent undercurrent of tension that had taken root. But as I approached home that evening, all the pretense crumbled the moment I saw him. There, standing by the staircase, as if he owned the space, was Evan. He looked exactly the same as ever, calm, deliberate, and undeniably present, but something in his stance suggested that this was no casual encounter. I paused at the doorway, my heart skipping a beat. The house, which had seemed so familiar and safe just hours before, now felt charged with unspoken implications. Thomas called, Evan said as soon as our eyes met. His voice was flat, almost dispassionate, as if delivering routine information. I blinked, caught off guard by his blunt statement. Thomas, my husband, was on a business trip, and now this news was the spark that ignited the moment. I managed to ask, "And what?" trying to mask the tremor in my voice. "He's delayed for another week," he replied. The words fell between us, heavy with consequences I had been trying to avoid. I could feel the weight of the situation intensify. My plan for the evening, my desperate attempt to maintain the illusion of normalcy, suddenly seemed pointless. The knowledge that Thomas would be absent for another week left me with a disconcerting mix of relief and dread. I took a step forward, aiming to pass by him and reclaim my space in the hallway. But before I could move any further, Evan's voice cut through the silence. "If we both know what's going to happen, why delay?" His tone was even, measured, yet the intensity in his eyes betrayed a deeper urgency. There was no room for negotiation in that moment. Every word he spoke seemed designed to force me to confront the truth I had been avoiding. For a long, tense moment, I stood there motionless. I did not have an answer, nor did I have the strength to offer one. The question hung in the air, charged with memories of that irreversible night and a subsequent cascade of events that had upended my life. Evan's presence was a stark reminder of the boundary I had crossed, a line that, once blurred, could never be redrawn. He did not wait for response. Instead, his eyes flickered with a mixture of determination and something I could not quite read, regret, perhaps, or resignation. Without another word, he took a step toward the staircase. His movement was decisive, leaving no room for discussion. It was clear that he was not going to back down or wait for me to catch up with his pace. His silence, his actions, all spoke of a decision made long ago. I felt the air thicken around me as I stood there, caught in a limbo between what I wanted to say and what I knew was inevitable. Every instinct urged me to speak, to ask for clarity, or to demand that this all stop. But I remained silent, unable to break the spell of the moment or to change the course that had been set in motion. The house around me was still, the only sound the soft echo of my own breathing as I struggled to process the finality of what was unfolding. Evan paused just before disappearing up the stairs, glancing back at me with eyes that promised more than his words had. That look told me that he was waiting for me to make a decision, to step forward and acknowledge the truth of what was happening between us. The unresolved tension between us was palpable, charged with the kind of energy that can neither be ignored nor easily dismissed. In that brief glance, I recognized that nothing would ever be the same again. I took a deep breath and tried to steady myself. The reality of my situation was undeniable. The choice before me was stark and unforgiving: continue the charade of normalcy while burying a secret that threatened to consume me, or face the consequences head-on and let the truth dictate the next steps of my life. I could feel the weight of every decision I had made in the past days, all converging into this critical moment. In that silence, with the echo of Evan's final words reverberating in my ears, I understood that this was my turning point. The past was no longer a distant memory. It was a force that demanded resolution. Every second of the day had led to this final confrontation, a moment that left no room for retreat. I remained where I was, frozen on the threshold of my own life, knowing that the next move would define everything that came after. Evan had made his stance clear without a need for further explanation. The choice was now mine, and now the choice was mine. I closed the door to his room. No words were exchanged. No excuses were made. I stood in the doorway for a moment, the sound of my own heartbeat loud in the silence that filled the space. Evan was sitting on the edge of the bed, waiting. His shoulders were tense, and his gaze, heavy and unyielding, fixed on me as if challenging me to speak. The atmosphere was charged, every second stretching out into eternity. I took a tentative step toward him, uncertain yet driven by a compulsion I couldn't fully understand. He slowly rose from the bed, his movements deliberate and calm despite the turmoil that had led us here. "You know this is wrong?" he asked softly, the question hanging in the air like a fragile promise of regret. "Yes," I replied, the word echoing in the quiet room. It was a simple admission, yet it carried the weight of every moment that had brought us to this crossroads. Neither of us stepped back or tried to break the tension. Instead, we stood locked in a silent confrontation of our own making. Evan's hand reached out, brushing against my shoulder. His fingers slid slowly down, sending a shiver through me that wasn't entirely pleasurable. The distance between us had vanished. We were now inches apart, the heat of his body merging with mine. The light in the room was dim and subdued, casting soft shadows that danced across the walls, while the air felt thick and oppressively warm. Without a word, he moved closer, his hands trailing along the curve of my back. In that precise moment, my robe loosened, slipping off my shoulders as if it were an innocent bystander to our unfolding conflict. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and alarmingly aware of every breath we took. Yet, despite the chaos of emotion, I did not retreat. I stayed, compelled by the intensity of our encounter and the unspoken understanding that had been building between us. His breathing grew deeper, more measured, as he looked at me, not as a mere companion, not as the timid man I had once known, but as someone transformed by our shared transgression. My fingertips, almost of their own accord, reached up to touch his collarbones, tracing the contours of his skin in a gesture that was both tentative and charged with unspoken meaning. They slid lower, and in that moment, the boundary between right and wrong became dangerously blurred. And then, suddenly, I caught sight of my reflection in the mirror mounted on the wall. The woman I saw staring back at me was a stranger. I recognized none of the hesitation, none of the uncertainty that had defined me mere minutes before. Instead, I saw someone teetering on the edge, someone who had almost crossed a line from which there was no return. The realization struck me like a jolt of cold water. I was about to lose myself completely. Evan leaned in further, his arms wrapping around my waist in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. But in that moment, I felt as if the air had been abruptly sucked from my lungs. I could barely breathe, suffocated not by passion, but by the overwhelming certainty that this was a mistake that could not be undone. "This isn't right," I whispered, though my voice was barely audible. I took a slow, deliberate step back, creating the smallest possible distance between us. It was an instinctive movement, a last grasp at control when everything seemed to be spiraling out of control. He tried to hold me, his grip tightening as if he were trying to anchor me to him, but the contact only fueled my rising panic. "What?" he demanded, confusion mingling with desperation in his tone. The question was simple, yet it carried the burden of every regret and every lost moment. In that split second, clarity cut through the haze of desire and mistake. I sharply lifted my robe, wrapping it around me like a shield against the overwhelming tide of emotions. "This should not have happened," I declared, my voice steadier now, imbued with the finality of my decision. Between us, there remained only one loaded look, a look that said everything without a single word. In that brief moment, I saw a change ripple across his face. His eyes, once dark with intent, now flickered with uncertainty, as if he too recognized the irreparable nature of what we had done. I didn't wait for him to speak, didn't give him the chance to explain or justify, because in that instant, nothing else mattered. I knew that I had to reclaim my life, to sever the ties to this moment that threatened to redefine everything I was. I stepped back once more, this time with a resolute determination. I turned and left the room, leaving behind the man, the mistake, and the heavy consequences of our shared transgression. As I walked away, the door closed softly behind me, marking the end of a chapter that could never be rewritten, because I left, leaving everything behind.